Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, a show that examines all aspects of sexuality, from physical to emotional to spiritual. Join our hosts as they discuss age-old questions, common misconceptions, and the latest topics surrounding sex. They'll tackle topics about sexuality from the complicated to the hilarious and everything in between. GSMC Sex Podcast is your show for all of your questions about sex, even some you might not have thought of yet.
Hi, folks. Thank you for tuning into the GSMC Sex Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host. I am Ainslie Caswell, and today I'm going to be covering the topic of consent, which can be sometimes kind of serious, sometimes a little playful, but overall it's something that is required, and we're going to talk about it. I'm going to preface this entire episode by saying that we're going to touch on some things that some people may find very sensitive. Some people may find them triggering and unpleasant to hear about because consent goes into areas like rape and sexual assault because consent is skipped in those types of instances. So what we're going to be talking about today is what consent is not, where consent issues have come up in the news and popular culture, and then finally, we're going to talk more specifically about what consent is in practice and what makes it sexy. So, what exactly is consent? You might not realize it, but you need to ask for consent in all areas of your life in a bunch of different things. It comes up in business practices constantly. It comes up in medical practice all the time, in almost any medical procedure. It comes up in contract agreements almost any time you need to sign anything. And sensibly, it comes up in sexual practices. When we get really technical about the word consent, because it is a very legal term, it has a few different definitions and different variations. There's really 4 different variations of the word consent. There's implied consent, express consent, informed consent, and unanimous consent. And we can break those down. And I know that sounds a little boring, but we can break them down, come up with examples about what this means in real life and what it means in real life both in and out of the bedroom. Because again, consent is a word that doesn't just apply to sexual practices or intimacy. It applies to so many areas of your life. It's just been highlighted as a very hot-button word as these issues have come to light in recent years, but it's a word that everyone needs to be aware of in many different areas. Financial issues, marriages, other types of partnerships, any sort of elderly management, power of attorney situations. Consent is extremely important. So let's start with implied consent. Implied consent is by far the hardest to either define or agree upon, and it has the most gray area because, by definition, it does not have to be defined by spoken words or expressly given by anyone. It is often largely defined by actions or even inaction, and is sometimes defined by the circumstances or situation that surrounds the participants that are involved in the situation. Implied consent is likely the term that you will hear when you have charges that may be brought up against somebody who's accused of rape or sexual assault, and they believe they're not guilty, and they say, I thought I had consent, but she didn't say yes, but she also didn't say no, and she didn't leave. And she was still participating, or at least I thought she was. And I thought that was implied consent. This is where I'm going to forward you back to our episode on communication, because if your partner is not speaking, then you want to look for other types of cues for communication, and or you want to speak to them and prompt them. Meanwhile, on the other end, the partner that you're with, it might not be going the way you think it's going in their head, and then they turn around and say, I didn't actually want to do that. And then later on, maybe an accusation comes forth. That's one of the reasons that implied consent has so much gray area, because it's largely up for interpretation in many situations. So rather than beat implied consent to a bloody pulp, I'll try to leave it at that and just try to define it as it's not expressly granted by anyone at any time. It's largely assumed and situational, which I hope I don't need to explain, will vary massively from situation to situation. So that right there will mostly not work in your favor if you rely on implied consent for all of your sexual situations. The next one, which is sort of the exact opposite, is express consent, which is a big, unambiguous, huge yes. In lawyer speak, you might call it asked and answered, meaning the question was asked and it was very clearly verbally answered. You ask for consent and they answer yes. Express consent is often verbal and sometimes even written, although not usually in your sexual relationships, because express consent is something that, like we discussed, it's used in a lot of other areas in the world, the legal world, the medical world, and other areas of business. You can use it in your sexual life, but you probably won't be writing anything down unless that's your kink. You can write out a sex contract. It's not unheard of. It's totally real. You can do whatever you want. You just can't do anything illegal with a sex contract. You just can't do that. But whatever else you want to do, if you want to like write down a thing and say, will you have sex with me tonight and let me put whipped cream on your, I don't know, you can write it down, make them sign it. Don't make them. You have to let them do it voluntarily. But I think that would be considered express consent. I'm pretty sure. Next is informed consent. Informed being similar, but meaning that you talked beforehand, possibly about any risks or conditions that you wanted to discuss, such as plans that you had for your sexual act or whatever you were planning on doing. And you had a rational and informed discussion. And so with that information, and with all of you or both of you or all y'all's being informed and now very smart about all the things that you want to do or wish to do or have plans to do, you went ahead with your plans. And that's informed consent. You can write that down too if you want, but then it might become express consent. But now you're informed. This sort of calls back to a segment in our communication episode about purposefully sitting down with your partner and making time to discuss things like fantasies or dreams or wants and needs. You can and should set aside time to do this. It's not just healthy for your relationship and puts you in a good, respectful headspace, but this is also about consent. This is about planning out what you're going to do, what both of you want and need for each other, but it's also a time for you to compare notes and get on the same page. And then if one of you says, hey, I want to do this, that's the perfect time for the other person to say, oh, I'm actually not into that. So can we skip that part? And that's a form of consent because it's the other person saying, oh, I'm not consenting to that. Or in the other direction, it's time for you to bring up something that you want and for the other person to say, oh, I want that too. And that's consent. This is a form of consent in advance. You can do this in the moment also, but this is informed consent. You're talking about it beforehand and you're getting information. It's an excellent, excellent way to talk about what you want to do and go in with as much information as you can about satisfying not just your partner, but yourself. If you don't want to do this verbally, you absolutely do not have to. Some people don't realize this or don't realize that they're going to be good at it or that they're going to like it, but you can do this in written form and not like in the contracty way that I mentioned earlier, like with express consent or any of that. Unless that's your thing, like unless you have a lawyer kink, that's totally fine. You want to pay $500, get a lawyer, that's fine. I'm not going to shame that. But you can write letters or notes or stream of consciousness to your partner expressing what you want or what you want to talk about or what you want to plan out or what you want to do to each other. Do it in email. Send emails to each other. If that's too weird, leave a notebook in the kitchen and alternate the pages and write notes to each other. If you share a house with your mom and that's too weird, I don't know your life. Write notes and slip your notes under each other's pillow every other night. And so you find them in the morning and it's like a little surprise from the alternative tooth fairy. Now it's the sexy note fairy instead. Surprise. There's one more type of consent, which is a little more general, and it should apply to any situation anyway. It's just referred to as unanimous consent, and it's defined as all parties unanimously agreeing to whatever the agreement is. I have a feeling this is more accurately used in miscellaneous legalities. In sexual activity, it should apply to basically any sexual activity. Unfortunately, there's a lot of sexual acts that occur without consent of one or more parties, and so this would technically not apply to many cases of rape and sexual assault. Meanwhile, it implies that it's referring to parties of more than two people, so it suggests that it would sexually apply to groups of, let's say, three or more. So things like group sex, parties, sex parties, swinging groups, orgies, things like that. So if we had to take a less cynical view of where this term would be used, it would be things like that. So now that I've gone through these four kind of basic but specific definitions of what consent is, you'd be surprised how many people still have questions. In my experience, this conversation often seems to be an age divide. I often have an issue with men of a certain age having an issue with the topic of consent. I've run into this issue when I've been voicing erotic fiction, and I find the question of authors asking me what my list of non-negotiables is, I find that question very frustrating. I would much rather a creator just be honest about the content of their material rather than them try to ask me what I will and won't do. And this is one of the reasons. I've tried to answer that it's challenging for me to do material that walks the line of consent. And authors have responded by saying that they, the creator of the material, are not sure if consent is a problem in their writing. And they're always men that are over a certain age. Always. So beyond the technical, clinical definitions of what consent is, there is still this large misunderstanding about what exactly it is. And typically these men want to have a lengthy dialogue with someone like me about how to go about moving forward with this? And won't I accept this material anyway? And isn't it okay? And don't I feel okay about it? And what can I do to help them and approve of it and move forward with it? And what's my opinion on it? They really, really, really want to discuss it with me at length. And I'm just going to be really as efficient as I can with any further thoughts that I have on what consent is. And then next we're going to talk about what consent is not. But if I can be a little more detailed about what consent definitely is, consent definitely is someone not being confused about their sexual experience, especially while it's happening. That person who's in that experience is not confused or scared about what's happening or what's going to happen next. They're not confused. And they're there willingly. They want to be there. Even if a part of their experience is about things like pain, degradation, shame, even if that's a component of it, they are there willingly. That's a huge component of BDSM. Things like being a sub, a huge component of being a sub is retaining a portion of your control. That's what safe words are all about. It's retaining your control in order to have an exit strategy because you want to be there. You have wants and needs that are about this sexual relationship, and you're there because you enjoy it. Even if a portion of it is about stereotypical negative things, you're there because it satisfies a piece of you, and so you engage in it willingly. And that's what consent is about. Consent is about not being in the dark about your experience. So someone who is willingly a part of the experience will have options if they suddenly decide, oh, this has crossed a line for me. So they have an exit strategy. They have a way to say, I don't want this anymore, in case it goes there. Consent is about still having a voice throughout your entire experience. Consent is about the concept of things like pain or degradation or shame not equaling a lack of a voice. People like subs or someone getting spanked or just the fact that you're a woman, none of that equals a lack of a voice in any relationship, but especially a sexual one. All of that is consent. Consent means that you still have a voice at any given time, prior, during, and after. It's just that simple. That's really what consent is about. I said the equivalent of this to an amateur writer who was emailing me about potentially being a narrator for some story he wrote. And he was still confused. He was still confused and still trying to get me to analyze or reread or edit some story he wrote. And I told him to leave me the alone because I really don't know what he wanted from me. I'm unsure if that man was trying to convince me that he was right, or if he was trying to get free editing out of me, or if he was just trying to waste my time because he thought that was a good way to exert power over me. But either way, I spent way too much time trying to explain to him something that he should have known innately. And that I think is one of the scariest parts of all this, is that there's an awful lot of people out there who just genuinely don't understand or don't want to understand the idea that sexual relationships and sexual dynamics are equal to the level that both parties continuously deserve a voice throughout the entire experience. That whole concept seemed to be not understandable to this person that I was speaking to. That as a concept seems to be not understandable to a certain percentage of people. because that's all consent is. That's it. So now that I think we've nailed down what exactly consent is, we'll move on to what it is not. And after that, we'll talk about where consent has come up in popular issues that you may have seen on the news or on the internet, and then how you can put it into practice. Stick around.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Hi, folks. Welcome back to the GSMC Sex Podcast. I'm Ainslie, and today we are tackling the occasionally complex issue of consent. Some would say it's complex. Some people would tell you that it should be extremely simple. But it gets into complex territory because it's basically subjective, because everybody's situation becomes dramatically different, because nobody gets busy in the same way. In the previous segment, we talked about what exactly consent is. And we broke it down by some clinical and technical definitions. We talked about legalities a little bit. We talked about a little bit of my personal experience with having conversations with someone who just didn't get it. And now we're going to talk about what consent is not. As before, I'm going to reiterate that this whole episode is going to touch on issues that some people might find kind of sensitive and triggering. We're probably going to mention some instances of sexual assault and rape. So just be aware if you choose to continue listening. So as I described at the end of the last segment, I once had a very frustrating conversation with someone who considered themselves an erotic fiction writer. He was soliciting me because he wanted me to narrate something that he had written. He was describing it to me. I didn't want to read the whole thing, particularly because he hadn't hired me yet. So he was describing it to me, and I was asking a few questions. And we started to discuss the topic of consent, and I said I wasn't super enthusiastic about narrating things that walked the line of consent. And he had a hard time understanding not only apparently the entire concept of consent, and I think he was one of those people that was frustrated that it was in the news lately, but he wanted me to explain it to him, and he seemed to want me to read his story in depth and either edit it or fix it for him. And he seemed to be one of those people who wanted to have that type of dialogue with me where he wanted to pick apart the various examples of things like, well, this happens during sex. Isn't that consent? And that's a horrible conversation to get into with anybody, frankly, because a lot of that, I think, has to do with an individual person's individual experiences that they have had, which have informed their opinions on sexuality. And then they use those opinions and knowledge to inform what they believe things like consent to be. That's the best conclusion that I can come to. So in this segment, which is what consent is not, I'm essentially going to have that conversation with myself. I'm going to bring up a list of devil's advocate type hypotheticals and say, but isn't consent this? And spoiler, the answer is always going to be no. The answer for all of these things is going to be no, that is not consent. but I'm going to give you the list anyway, because that's what the segment is. What consent is not? Let's start with physical responses. Aren't physical responses like getting hard or getting wet or perky nipples? Aren't those consent? Because that means that they're excited. That's consent, right? No, it's not. It's not. And the reason it's not is because these are basic biological functions that a lot of times you don't choose to participate in. These are Pavlovian type responses that your body kicks off without you needing to do anything. A good example is morning wood. Guys, you wake up in the morning, hard as a rock, depending on how young and healthy you are. And what did you do? What did you do for that to happen? Anything? Morning wood is notoriously known as your body kind of running a systems check. And it's little else than that. Really. It's really not much more than that. And morning wood will lessen with intensity as you get older. I wasn't just making a joke at your expense there. It really does get less intense as you get older, really because your body is just getting less virile and your hormones are changing and your whole body's changing. Women have just as many, if not more complicated hormonal changes as we approach menopause and we go through all sorts of other wacky changes. And our moistness will change and evolve as we get older also. I can't and won't speak for all females out there, but I think we will lubricate more when we're ovulating. And that's because our body wants to have sex because we're trying to get pregnant. We're trying to have that baby. We're not consciously turned on. We're not consciously thinking about the D. Our body's just kicking off those signals because an egg dropped. But we don't know that's happening. Our brain doesn't know that's happening. We're not thinking about your junk and getting wet because of it. That did not happen. And you might have been dreaming about boobs. Who am I kidding? But you just woke up with a stiff one because your body's like running a systems check. You might have been dreaming about boobs too. But even if you weren't, you woke up with an erection because that's just the way the world works. So just because someone has a certain physical response does not guarantee that they want to have sex with you. That doesn't guarantee anything, nothing. And it's a really poor excuse for someone to use for why they should have sex with another person or why someone wanted to without further confirmation. It's a pretty bad reason. Another one that's even worse is clothing. And I feel like society has pretty much squashed this one down. It's one that was used very, very often when I was younger. In the 90s, it was used a lot. Whenever anything like a sexual assault or rape case got brought up socially, the first question was, what was she wearing? We were only, in the 90s at least, we were only about 20-ish years out of the first wave of women's lib. So freedom of clothing and freedom of expression was still, at least I felt, was still very new and very closely watched by the adults. My grandparents and even my parents are still very much of the opinion that people should not wear whatever they want. My public school would not allow hats. I don't know if schools are still like this, but I went to a public school, a state-run school, and no one was allowed to wear hats. Girls were never, ever, ever allowed to show midriff or shoulders. We were never allowed to wear spaghetti straps. Skin showing was a huge, huge thing. Meanwhile, there was a big double standard for boys. Saggy pants were hugely in fashion when I was in school. There was a lot of body shaming with girls, but not boys, and teen pregnancy was a huge problem. And whenever any sort of sexual assault or rape came up, there was a big question over clothing. And this still happens, even though the conversation and that topic has been quieted by advocates. But similar to racists, these people have been quieted. They didn't go away. They still exist. They've just sort of been put in their place. So I'm still very aware that if I wear a certain thing out in public, that I get looked at a certain way. I have been coached, essentially, by people at different intervals in my life to somehow change my clothing or change the way it sits on me. One example that sticks out in my mind is when I was working at a retail banking job and I was helping a woman. I stepped away from the counter to dip into a drawer, and I came back to her and she said to me, "You may want to button up your sweater because when you bent over, I could see something." Like she said it as if she was warning me. Like, "Oh, you may want to cover up because when you went into that drawer, I could see either down your shirt or up your skirt," or something like that. And I looked at her and I was like, I honestly believed that the problem wasn't my outfit. I think it was the fact that just people are looking far too intently at other people's bodies. And why in God's name are you looking so intently for a problem with my clothes that you feel the need to tell me that I need to button my cardigan up past my collarbone while I am standing behind a counter that comes up above my ribs, and you feel like I'm the one who needs to fix this? Why do you feel the need to do that? I really, really felt like that was not my problem to fix, honestly. And there's still a lot of people that do. They do feel like it's our responsibility, the wearer of the clothing, to protect our bodies visually to such an extreme that an onlooker will never be able to see past our hemline, past our neckline, inside the sleeve of our shirt. It's my responsibility to do that. And I just found that so strange. And I feel like the accusation of clothing inviting the actions of another person is a similar argument. It's, well, what were you wearing that somehow initiated the physical contact of another person? Nothing. How is that even possible? How is it possible that my clothing somehow initiated or caused the touch or possible violence of another human? Guess what? It didn't. It just didn't. Another thing that didn't happen is you didn't get consent by proxy. I'm not sure how often this happens, but I feel like it might be something that happens among younger people, because this does feel like something that is very high school, but it's getting consent through another person. It's the equivalent of asking your friend, "Hey, does she like me?" And them saying, "Yeah, no, she totally likes you." And you taking that as gospel. She didn't tell you that she liked you. The friend told you that she liked you. So you technically still don't know if it's really true because it's just hearsay. You still need to ask that person directly. I'll give you an example of when this went well for me one time and did not backfire. So I had friends once. Now I have no friends, but I used to have friends. And I told one of them, let's call him Dave. I told Dave, "Hey, I think our other friend," let's call him Sam. I said, "Dave, I think Sam is kind of cute." And Dave said, "Oh my God, Sam just broke up with his longtime girlfriend." And I said, "No way. That's sad, but that's kind of awesome. Wow, I didn't know he was single now." And Dave said, "Do you want to hook up with him or something?" And I was like, is that a possibility? I guess that would be cool. And then he played go-between, and Sam and I hooked up and spent one night together. And then that was it, because we weren't actually local to each other. So it was just like a one-night thing, and then I went back to my city. and everything was cool. But what if Dave being the go-between wasn't enough information? And what if me and Sam weren't on the same page? We would have needed to talk to each other more. You can't really get consent through another person because somebody else can't really consent for you. That just happened to work out nicely, especially because we all knew each other in advance. And I trusted the people involved, and I trusted everybody to kind of represent me accurately. And ultimately, Sam and I did speak to each other very clearly, and we knew what was going on. He didn't just show up at my house with no notice and start touching me. That's not what happened. But I think the other reason that my situation worked out is because the timeline was very short. This all happened within maybe 3 days of each other. This situation could have gone very badly if, let's say, a year or two had passed and my feelings may have changed. What if I had said something to Dave and then a year went by and then Sam had tried to initiate something and I would have probably said, what are you doing? What? Where did this come from? Because just because someone expresses interest one time on one occasion, that doesn't guarantee anything in perpetuity. Inside a relationship, outside a relationship, period. That's it. And that's its own bullet point. Previous consent is not consent in the future. Previous consent of any type, to your face, previous consent inside of a sexual encounter doesn't guarantee future consent. Previous consent to a specific sexual act does not guarantee that sexual act again. Even consent to a singular act can be revoked in the moment. Someone can step away from it for basically any reason that they want, but just for a quick selection, someone can cite reasons like physical pain, emotional pain. I just don't want to do this anymore. Anything, literally anything. Some other smaller and even worse things that are definitely not consent are things like an unresponsive partner. If your partner is unresponsive, even if they're conscious, if they're unresponsive, you know that they're not there for it, that's not consent. Any sort of exchange of goods, such as, oh, but I bought her this, but I bought him that, but we had dinner, but I spent all this time, but I spent all this money, but I gave them a gift, but we've spent so many years together, but I did this for them, aren't they going to do this for me? No, none of that requires anybody to do a sexual act for you or anybody else. But I was having fun. Well, the other person wasn't, so they're allowed to stop. But we were doing the thing. We were doing the thing with the name. We were doing that thing. We were doing that with the thing. Just because you were doing a specific thing with a specific name, and it sounds like you were really psyched about it, just because it was a specific thing, that doesn't mean you have to keep doing it. I'm not sure exactly what that points to, if it's some sort of like OCD thing or an ADHD thing or a sexual obsession or a porn thing, but sometimes there's a or maybe it's just like a control narcissistic thing, like I'm in control and we're doing a thing and I have a plan and I'm going to see it through to the end, or like, I don't know, maybe it's just pure selfishness. But sometimes there's this really intense, like, no, we were doing this thing and it's called the wheelbarrow and it's like, I'm doing it, and I'm doing it and we're going to do it. It's like, just because you were doing a thing till the end and you had this like clear picture in your head about how it was going to be, none of that obligates anyone else to do it with you. Sorry? That entire narrative privately in your brain, it has exclusively to do with your wants and your needs, and it obligates no one else to participate at all. And so none of that looks like consent. It looks like exactly the opposite. It looks like oppression, and it looks like you're forcing someone else into your narrative. That's all. That's what that looks like. And it looks like we've mapped out what consent is not. and I hope it was all very clear for you. Next, we're going to talk about where consent has come up, especially recently, in the world. And you might not like it, but where have you seen it in the news, in the media, and some other places?
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hi, folks. You're back with the GSMC Sex Podcast. This is Ainslie, and we are in the middle of talking about consent in sexual relationships. And we've gone through what exactly consent is, what consent is not, and now I'm going to try to tackle where we see consent lately in our world, be it the news, be it the media. What are we seeing? And what are we seeing over and over again? And how are we supposed to understand it? Again, I'm going to start off with a little disclaimer. Given the topic, we are tackling some things that are a little uncomfortable and sometimes triggering. There are going to be mentions of topics like rape and sexual assault. So if you continue listening, be mindful of that and how it may affect you. Especially with that warning, I think I want to start off with potentially the most upsetting topic on my list, or at least it seemed like the most upsetting topic on my list when I was gathering some things to talk about. It's likely not something that a lot of people want to give a lot of attention to, given the distance that we have from the event, and nobody wants to give this case or this person any more attention because that was part of the rallying cry behind this case. It was, don't give this person any attention. But then there was also an opposite rallying cry of, give his name lots of attention so he is labeled as the rapist that he is. And you may already know what I'm getting at based on how I've set this up. I'm talking about the Brock Turner case. So I don't really want to discuss Brock Turner as a person. That's not really why I brought this up. I think the case itself and the details that surround it and the circumstances under which it was magnified are kind of fascinating from a social aspect and a legal one too. And as far as the topic that we're covering today, it's a really pivotal one to look at because the entire case, and I think one of the biggest reasons that it blew up in the media is because the whole case, at least the way it was portrayed, it revolved around the topic of consent. That was really the keystone word around the whole case and around the entire media frenzy. It was the word consent. If we go back to the very beginning of this hour, I opened up what consent is with trying to define implied consent. And that plays hugely into the Brock Turner case because the Brock Turner case was largely about the gray area of implied consent. I would like to say before I go any further, because if you're listening to me talk about this and you're already getting frustrated or angry or uncomfortable in any capacity, that I am trying to come at this from an informed perspective of being familiar with the court transcripts. I'm familiar with some of the actual court proceedings, but more specifically, I've read the statements from each of the parties involved. And something that I think got lost when the whole case got blown up is that Brock Turner's statement is very clear and concise, and I'm well aware that a lot of people don't believe that he wrote it himself. A lot of people believe that either his parents wrote it or his lawyer wrote it and he was nowhere near it, and some people believe it's a complete fabrication and was made just to protect him. And that being said, his statement goes from the beginning of the night to the moment he got arrested. Meanwhile, the victim's statement has a huge dead space, longer than you would expect. She began to black out at the party still. She doesn't remember leaving the party at all. And her memory picks up possibly the next day. She doesn't remember the entire evening, not just the period of the assault, but the entire evening. And so anything in Brock Turner's statement cannot be corroborated by almost anybody. And so when the whole case began to snowball, something that happened was Turner began to get villainized as a predator. And it's not that this wasn't justified. This was a pretty horrible case with details that no one wanted to hear about, and the victim came out of it being very confused and scared, and people didn't really know what to think about it. And the whole Turner case got held up as the poster child of all rape and assault cases. And in a way, this became sort of unfortunate because I think it made people mistakenly believe that many rape and assault cases are similar when they're not. So again, I'll refer to the statements that are in the court transcripts, because whether or not you believe that Brock Turner's statement is real, accurate, written by him, or written by his lawyers, it's the only thing that we have on record to go by. And the victim statement, while it does provide some information, it does have a big dead space. And there are some supplemental statements on the peripheral that provide additional information as well. And largely, the circumstances seem to show us that the case as a whole was an issue of implied consent gone wrong. And then once it blew up in the media, it became a narrative of a predatory assault, which is very different. Both of these issues are important. Both of these issues need to be talked about. Both of them happen regularly to women and men. Both of them are systemic. Both of them are violent. Both of them happen on college campuses. Both of them happen to drunk people. But it's highly unlikely that both of them happened here in the Brock Turner case. And unfortunately, this became sort of a trial by media, and once the details snowballed, the media and the public decided that it was a violent assault case rather than any other type of consent issue. So in the context of what we're discussing here or anywhere else in regards to Brock Turner violating a woman or not getting proper consent or the interaction somehow being appropriate, I don't think the question is whether or not he did anything wrong. The question really becomes what type of consent boundary got violated? And I don't know if that question ever accurately got answered. Ever. I'm not sure if it got answered even in the final proceedings of that case. I'm also, in asking these questions, I'm not ever saying that lawyers or parents that have too much money and time on their hands ever have good intentions for anybody, especially victims. Also universities that have too much money, I don't think they have good intentions either. If I made a list of every celebrity who's been sexually violated and rattled off that list to you, I don't think this podcast would end anytime soon, so I won't bore you. But someone who I wasn't necessarily planning on talking about, but who made my list anyway, and she made an appearance on my bisexuality podcast. Not literally, she wouldn't come anywhere near me, I'm sure, is Demi Lovato. I've made a point to say that I don't really follow her because I haven't been I'm not like a Demi fan per se, so I don't really know anything about her. But I watched her YouTube doc special that got released in a few installments on YouTube, and her documentary makes a point to highlight that she was sexually assaulted by her drug dealer the night of her overdose. And then, as a sort of backwards way of trying to fix the problem, she voluntarily got back in touch with her dealer while she was struggling with recovery, brought him back into her home, got drugs from him, and then voluntarily slept with him, which some people might find insane. I don't think it's that crazy, personally, but I'm someone who struggles with a few different aspects of trauma and mental health. I have not been a victim of sexual assault specifically, but I've also struggled with a substance, so I understand that push and pull as well. So it doesn't seem totally crazy to me. This whole thing reeks of control. And she speaks about that. She speaks of the concept of, yes, this seems insane, but it was my way of rewinding everything, trying to go back to the beginning and making it my choice. And a part of that was the drugs, too. I was choosing to go back to the drugs, use the drugs, but use it responsibly so that I didn't OD, and also make a choice to f this guy, but not have him rape me, so then I have that under control too. Win-win. And to somebody's trauma brain, that math makes sense. That's trauma math. That's alcoholism math, that's drug math, that's trauma math. And you're doing it in your head and you're like, oh, that totally equals what I'm looking for, so I'm gonna do it. A lot of trauma survivors really are looking for solutions. There a lot of survivors and even addicts are solution-oriented people, and a lot of their choices are, in fact, motivated by trying to find solutions to their problems. The issue is that in their problem solving, they're making decisions that are massively informed by their trauma. And that's the part that goes off the rails because you're doing bad math. That's all. That's all. Your intentions are good. This is why people like this often get targeted by predators and ultimately get raped, like Demi Lovato did by her dealer. I think it's a misconception and a misunderstanding that addicts or trauma survivors will get targeted for things like sexual assault or rape because they're incapacitated. Do you think Demi Lovato got raped because she was unconscious? Maybe. We don't know. We weren't there. I think she may have been. She may have said that. But people like this will get targeted by predators also because their logic is bad. And predators can pick up on this very quickly. When she called that guy back up after she got clean and then relapsed and she had sex with him voluntarily, you think he didn't know exactly what was happening? You think he didn't know? You think that guy didn't know that he raped her? You think he didn't know he raped her the night he gave her the drugs that caused her a life-threatening overdose that famously landed her in the hospital and almost killed her? You think he was unaware of any of those things? And then she invited him back over for more drugs and some voluntary sex. And he was like, cool, I'll be there. You think he didn't know any of those things? And he came over and was like, yeah, I'll be there. These people are very aware. And how is this relevant to consent? Because Demi Lovato is somebody who was assaulted by a person who was consistently in her life giving her a brain-altering substance that made her unable to consent. And it altered her on a long-term basis. It damaged her on a long-term basis. And the person who was supplying her with that substance sexually assaulted her on the very evening that he gave her so many drugs that she famously almost died. That's where you get into predator territory, where somebody is so aware of your inability to make decisions that their relationship with you escalates to the level of sexual assault, where they finally trust your inability to make decisions and they trust their ability to have so much power over you that they can finally cross that boundary that they say, okay, I'm going to move forward with this. And don't you also believe that Demi Lovato's dealer was also very, very aware that he was protected by her level of shame? He was already very aware that she was hiding her entire lifestyle from everyone in her life. If he raped her, why would she come forward? Why would she come forward and tell anyone, oh, my drug dealer raped me? Everyone in her life would go, whoa, whoa, you're what? You're who? You're doing heroin? What are you talking about? She would have to blow up an entire area of her life just to come forward and say she was assaulted. By nature of who she is and the circumstances that she's in, she would have to stay quiet. And her assaulter knows that. And there are so many situations within the confines of Hollywood that exist like that, exactly like that, where many people feel protected because of status. And a name I wanted to touch on, because we are talking largely about consent, and she's been in the news a lot recently, is Britney. And although Britney Spears is being talked about a lot right now, which is great and it really needs to be discussed, it's a little unfortunate that we're not discussing the word consent very often when we're talking about the Britney Spears issue, because it largely revolves around consent also. The Britney Spears issue revolves around consent because Britney Spears has had all of her autonomy taken away. The entire issue surrounding Britney's conservatorship is that she is not permitted to make most of her own adult decisions. And that entire issue is rooted in consent. Every decision, every major decision that is being made about Britney Spears' life or anything that she's allowed to do or not allowed to do is going through a series of channels or a series of people that are not Britney Spears, and they get to make those decisions on her behalf. Sometimes she is consulted, and sometimes she is not, and that revolves around the issue of autonomous consent, which has been taken away from her for more than 10 years on the basis of ambiguous mental health concerns, all of which seem to go back to a singular incident that occurred in front of the paparazzi, again, more than 10 years ago. And then a certain amount of people had a certain amount of power and money who were able to more or less revoke her access to her life and her autonomy. And that's a consent issue. And so here we're looking at consent on a long-term scale, on a larger scale with a larger group of players when it comes to things like fame and money. And now we're getting the public involved because she has an incredibly large fan base and a very lengthy career at this point. So now she has these people who can advocate for her to try to get her autonomy back. And not everyone has that. So in conclusion, free Britney, amen. So now that you know what consent is not, and you know what it looks like, how do you practice it? Keep listening.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America's Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Sex Podcast, everyone. This is Ainslie, and we are wrapping up our hour on consent, which I know at first blush doesn't always sound like a very sexy topic. And it often isn't. It's often a very technical topic. We've been awfully technical for the vast majority of this hour, haven't we? We started off with dictionary-type definitions. That's sexy, right? English majors out there? Sexy dictionary times. Anyway, so I thought, similar to our communication episode, why don't we wrap this up with some actual examples of how to put consent into practice? I remember hearing similar arguments, whether or not they were real or manufactured, about protection when I was coming up as a teenager. I can't use a condom because it'll ruin the mood. I feel like there are similar arguments about consent. I don't know if they're real or manufactured by 4chan or whatever, but I don't want to ask for consent because it'll ruin the mood. Well, you don't have to, stop everything and, issue a memo that says, "Good evening, miss. May I place my penis inside your vaginal opening?" That's not how consent has to work. I mean, it can work like that. People are really into Bridgerton right now. Is that Bridgerton? Is that how Bridgerton? I don't watch it. So if that's how it works and that's how you want to do it, go for it. But if that's not your thing and you don't want to issue a British Bridgerton memo, then try these other things. You can integrate consent into almost any type of your preferred sexual communication and or sexual foreplay that you like. And we touched on one of them earlier, and that is discussion beforehand about things like kinks or fetishes, let's say. So having a discussion with your partner beforehand about the details of what you're going to do, especially when it comes to things like kinks or fetishes, the parameters of those things are really best set up beforehand. And the entirety of those types of conversations revolves around consent because you're setting up boundaries. And your boundaries are really dictated by consent because each party is either agreeing or disagreeing to participate in the things that you're discussing. So that's an easy way to map out your consent discussion. If you don't have as specific a plan and you're just kind of winging it, for lack of a better term, and maybe your sex is more, dare I use the term, vanilla, let's earmark that also to have a whole separate discussion and a whole separate episode about that word, because I think that's also been misunderstood entirely. What I'm intending it to mean right now in this moment is to describe the type of sex that does not need any sort of advanced explanation or planning for yourself and your partner. You're just going into it and it's your standard of normal. This can vary within cultures, but we're not really here for that discussion. So it's considered conventional sex for you, and the you depending on who you are and where you are and who you're with, that may vary. But let's say that your sex is kind of normal and you're just going into it with no advance plan. Consent can still, and often should, still happen in real time in those moments where you didn't necessarily speak or plan anything beforehand. And you can do that by asking things like, do you want to have sex? Or do you have time for a quickie? Or asking specific things like, can I go down on you? Do you want to go back to my place and have sex? Can I take that off of you? Can I help you unzip that? If you're already in the middle of things, you can do regular check-ins that very easily translate into dirty talk. Do you like that? Do you want me to keep going? Do you like it when I touch you there? How do you want it? Are you turned on right now? How does this feel? Can I kiss you here? You can integrate protection talk into this. Can I put the condom on for you? Ask each other what positions you want to try. Do you want to try anal? Do you want to try reverse cowgirl? Ask about specific body parts. Can I put this in my mouth? Do you like my tongue here? Does this turn you on? Do you like when I touch you here? Turn your questions into statements. I want you inside me. I want you inside my mouth. I want to taste you. I want to feel you tremble inside me. I want to feel you explode. I want to make you explode. You can follow those with further questions looking for affirmation. Would you like that? Do you want that too? Do you want to feel me inside you? Do you want me inside you? Did any of that sound like it killed the mood? Any of it? Oh, okay. All right. I'm just trying to prove a point, really, is all I'm trying to do. That's all. I am just a deliverer of facts. That's all. Now, if you still consider yourself very uncomfortable with a lot of this verbal communication, if you are very uncomfortable with dirty talk in general, if you just don't want to speak during all the naughty time, if that whole concept just makes you uncomfortable, turns you off, if you don't like any of this stuff at all and none of it appeals to you, consider having a conversation with your partner about employing a safe word. Even if you don't do BDSM stuff and none of that is in your practices, that doesn't mean you can't have a safe word. Anything can be a safe word, and a safe word can be used at any time for any reason. Because a safe word really just means stop. That's all it means. You can have a safe word for anything. I don't know. Honestly, we should have had a safe word for gym class, for like kickball and stuff, so that I could yell out at the gym teacher, be like, get these kids off of me. I can't do this anymore. That would have been ideal. So you can agree with your partner privately on like, hey, I'm just going to say this word whenever I want to clearly communicate to you that I'm out, that I'm done. And then no one has to be confused or embarrassed or cross any lines that they were previously uncomfortable crossing. This can also be helpful with partners that may have a problem saying no. Honestly, I am someone who has a problem or at least has a blurry line with the word no because I have been perpetually confused about where my rights are. And to be perfectly honest, I have not spoken to enough of my peers about this. I feel very singular and alone in my struggle to assert myself with various partners. This isn't a singular problem that I have with one person. It's been perpetual with many people where I'm unsure where to assert myself in various areas of my sexual life. And part of it is, when do I have the ability to step away from an experience once I am no longer enjoying myself? And I can't be the only person, and I also can't be the only woman. And I'm saying that as someone who is not being sexually abused, and I am not in a BDSM relationship, and I can see that it would be useful in a few different areas. So if you feel like it would be useful to you in any capacity, there's no rules for how you can use a tool like that and how you can't. So go ahead and use it if you think it would be helpful. I might do it. I'll go use it. I'll use it tomorrow. I won't, because my vibrator doesn't need a safe word. It doesn't matter. There's also wordless consent. Again, this was touched on a little bit in our communication episode, but wordless consent can look like things like reciprocated body language. One partner may take the other partner's hand and move it to a place where they want it. If they're not pushing your hand away, if they're willingly accepting your touch, if they are encouraging your touch, if they are putting your hand on their body and actively encouraging more of your touch and more of the activity, that falls into the realm of implied consent because they are continuing to participate actively in what you're doing. And the consent is, as defined by implied consent, the consent is defined by the circumstances that you're surrounded by and the willing participation. Consent outside of the bedroom often looks like intense flirting and kind of pre-foreplay. Things like sexting. But it's probably going to look like really overt sexting. Things like, I want that dick in my pussy later tonight at 11:47 p.m. It's probably going to be really specific. But again, remember, all of that can be revoked later, even if it's in writing, even if they gave you their address. Sorry, don't come to my house. Just to wrap this all up nicely and be really clear and not ambiguous and try not to be punchy and make any more jokes, I went to RAINN.org. For anybody who doesn't know, RAINN is an organization that supports victims of rape and sexual assault, and you can get more information at RAINN.org. That's RAINN, RAINN, with 2 N's, .org. And I went there. They have a section on consent, and there is something here about enthusiastic consent, which they acknowledge is something that is a bit new and wasn't talked about prior to recent years because, again, kind of a newer concept. So I'm going to read to you from the RAINN website about the definition of enthusiastic consent. RAINN says, enthusiastic consent is a newer model for understanding consent that focuses on a positive expression of consent. Simply put, enthusiastic consent means looking for the presence of a yes rather than the absence of a no. Enthusiastic consent can be expressed verbally or through nonverbal cues, such as body-positive language like smiling, maintaining eye contact, and nodding. These cues alone do not necessarily represent consent, but they are additional details that may reflect consent. It is necessary, however, to still seek verbal confirmation. The important part of consent, enthusiastic or otherwise, is checking in with your partner regularly to make sure that they are still on the same page. Enthusiastic consent can look like asking permission before you change the type or degree of sexual activity with phrases like, "Is this okay?" Confirming that there is reciprocal interest before initiating any type of physical touch. letting your partner know that you can stop at any time. Periodically checking in with your partner, such as asking, "Is this still okay?" Providing positive feedback when you're comfortable with an activity. Explicitly agreeing to certain activities, either by saying yes or other affirmative statements like, "I'm open to trying that." Using physical cues to let the other person know you're comfortable taking things to the next level. Note, physiological responses like an erection, lubrication, arousal, or orgasm are involuntary, meaning that your body might react one way even when you are not consenting to the activity. Sometimes, perpetrators will use the fact that these physiological responses occur to maintain secrecy or minimize a survivor's experience by using phrases such as, "You know you liked it." In no way does a physiological response mean that you consented to what happened. If you have been sexually abused or assaulted, it is not your fault. If you've experienced sexual assault, you are not alone. To speak with someone who is trained to help, call the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 800-656-HOPE or chat online at online.rain.org. Oh, okay, I told you it wasn't going to be sunshine and rainbows the whole time, right? So just like every installment, I hope you learned something, I hope you had some fun, and I hope you know what consent is now. And if you still don't, then I hope you have a nice long walk into the ocean. Thank you so much for listening to the GSMC Sex Podcast, which is brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Ainslie Caswell. Remember to subscribe to the show and sign up for notifications wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a nice review. Don't forget to follow us on socials like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Just search for GSMC or me, Ainslie Caswell. Thank you so much, and I'll see you on the next one.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From sex and relationships to health and wellness, life and happiness, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast.